welcome. Thank you for coming out on such a nice weather day in our Minnesota summers that we try to enjoy before they fleet by. My name is Michaela, or Mickey, and I've been here at the Eastside Freedom Library for about 18 months, working on establishing a community digital repository for community archives. And I was sitting at the little table in the nook over there one day and opened up a package that came to the library, and it had Chaun's book in it. I immediately was fascinated with the title, flipping through it, the subject matter, and reached out to see if he would grace us with having a book launch here, and here we are. So thank you all for joining us. I'm going to go ahead and read a bit of Chaun's bio and then introduce also the conversation partner for today's event, Dr. James Robinson. Chaun, I believe this is from your site, thefullstop.net, so it's probably your words that I'm reading, the initial line here. We'll see. I don't want to plagiarize. Chaun Webster is a poet and graphic designer living in Minneapolis whose work interrogates Blackness as a way to interrogate the world. In his first work of nonfiction, poet Chaun Webster blends memoir, archival research, visual poetics, and cultural criticism to trace the ways structural anti-Black violence has shaped his inheritance and grapples with the question of how to know and mourn the kin he was never able to meet. Webster is particularly drawn to his grandfather Reginald, who worked for years as a Pullman porter, who was denied rest while his labor enabled rest for others, and who died without receiving a pension before Webster was born. Returning to the figures of Reginald in the train, Webster explores the relationship between comportment and confinement, speaking in tongues in the Pentecostal church, the ancestral meeting place of dreams, his fraught relationship with his mother, and moments with his own child. Throughout, Webster also reflects on non-biological kinship, tethering his and his predecessors' lives to those of several historical Black figures, Harriet Jacobs, John Henry, Henry Box Brown, and Henry Dumas, a writer who was killed by New York City police while riding the subway. Attempting to exhaust the possibilities of the sentence and the grammar of anti-Blackness, Webster riffs and rails on the debris within reach, part elegy, part archival detective story, and part visual poem. Without Terminus is a philosophically rigorous and deeply moving text that takes us beyond the archive of loss. And then I would also like to give a short introduction to Dr. James Robinson. He's a native son of St. Paul, a railroad hub. James Robinson comes from a family of railroad workers, dining car waiters and cooks, and railway and Pullman porters. Dr. James Alexander Robinson is currently the Assistant Professor of Black Studies within the Ethnic, Gender, Historical, and Philosophical Studies Department at Metropolitan State University. He earned the Interdisciplinary Studies PhD in Black Studies from the University of Iowa, Iowa City, where he also earned a Master of Arts degree in history. His Bachelor's of Arts degree is in anthropology from Macalester College. His research specialty is the historical study of Black railroad dining car cooks and waiters and their unions, communities, and families, and on Black railroad workers, Pullman porters, redcaps in general. James has written on the history of St. Paul's Pilgrim Baptist Church and teaches courses on forms of Black studies, Black thought, Black life in wealth and poverty, Black intellectual history, Black cultural history, Black life and culture, and African Americans in Minnesota. Prior to Metro State, Dr. Robinson completed a postdoctoral research fellowship at the University of Michigan Center for Social Solutions and worked as a digital research associate with the Digital Scholarship and Publishing Studio at the University of Iowa. He worked at the Smithsonian's Institution's National Museum of African American History and Culture as curator of Giving Voice, the Power of Words in African American Culture, and as research coordinator for The Will to Adorn, African American Diversity, Style, and Identity for the Center for Folklife and Cultural Heritage. His publications include People's Poets, Demotic Rhythms, and the Riddle of Black Internationalism in African American Literature and Transition, 1940 to 50, Cambridge University Press. And Giving Voice, the Power of Words in African American Culture, Smithsonian Folklife Festival Program. I'd like to welcome both Dr. James Robinson and Chaun Webster.
Hello? I think you gotta flip. Oh, it is. Okay, so I'm gonna read briefly from Without Terminus, and then we'll engage in some conversation, and then we'll open it up, and that's gonna be the order and flow. I think I have this connected to the monitor because there's some visual elements from what I'm reading from, but I'm not sure why it's not currently. There we go. Okay, so I'm going to read from a piece, and then we'll get into this kind of brief, like, sprawling essay of sorts. A black rail worker was born in 1913, served as a porter for the Great Northern Railroad for 25 years, and then retired. He died sometime later. In 1913, there was a rail worker, a porter. He served the Great Northern Railroad and died sometime after retirement. A rail worker served as a porter and then retired. For 25 years, a porter served the Great Northern Railroad. He was born in 1913. He was black. He died. A rail worker was a porter for 25 years. He worked for retirement. He died. A rail worker died after retirement. A black was born a rail worker, a porter for the Great Northern. He served. He retired. A black worker was born a porter for the railroad, and retirement was later. A black worker died. He retired later. For 25 years, a rail worker died for the Great Northern Railroad. Retirement was always after. A black serves and rails and dies on the road. Sometime later, he is born a porter. A black was born a railroad, was born dying. 25 years is sometime. Black is retired time. The later born still serve. If a black is born on the railroad after 25 years, he dies and the Great Northern says he served and retired. If a black doesn't work, he dies on the railroad. If a black works for the railroad, he dies a Great Northern death. In 1913, some say blacks are born porters serving Great Northern fantasies of retirement. A rail worker laughs later and dies. Some say progress is born with the rail. 25 years later, a porter cannot serve, cannot retire, and so he dies. Black years are born working on some railroad of the Great North. The train moves. Black years are still. A rail worker cannot retire, so he dies and haunts the railroad. A railroad cannot be born unless a black dies, but such is progress. Somewhere along the railroad, there is a group of blacks building a coffin, waiting to be porters. Something about the Great North requires a black porter dying to retire, but who ends up only dying. Something about the railroad shores up an imagined forward. It does so by steamrolling through black rail workers. They all die and cannot retire. When a black is born, may the ledger show accounts are payable to the railroad. If you do not have a black worker, imagine the railroad in service and the sound of their dying. Now you may lay down and retire. Some say later we all retire on some big railroad up in the Great North beyond. The blacks are dying to find out. Heard that the railroad was a jolly ride, that 25 years was a blink, the Great North tickling every imaginable fancy to the tune of blacks dying. Some say a train awaits to abduct the black-born, their years a wraith. If you should find yourself a black worker for some railroad of the North, 25 years of dying will prove insufficient for retirement. Blacks born dead on the rail, rail and wail, but they never retire. Did he make it out alive? You already know the answer to this question, yet you are still compelled to ask. You work with words which, unlike the empty wallet you have inherited, is not a material you can touch. But you wonder if in reordering this material you might disrupt what is presupposed. But no new order has ever changed the outcome. And thank you. And I'm just going to read from this piece, which is like the second section of the book. And it begins with a quote by Fred Moten. And maybe we'll have it. So it says, is there an underground railroad in the sentence? And I'm really interested in sentences both as a way that we communicate in written communication, but also sentences in the way that we think about carcerality, right? And so as we think about time, right? So is there an underground railroad in the sentence? You've been thinking about the sentence as writing that takes place above ground, bringing together the subject and predicate to say something or ask something. Certainly to say or ask those things to completion, and here is typically where you would insert a period, concluding the idea and moving on to another. And if this is the protocol of the sentence, can you bring it underground? Can you take the sentence and go astray? The sentence has many lines. How we read something at the line level, the train of thought configured to the line, the one-dimensional figure extending itself to connect 2 points. You imagine yourself as one of those points that the sentence or line has led to. In this way, the line is spatial and temporal, an arrow or widow's peak pointing towards something. You are unsure if you are the intercept or destination. The sentence you are concerned with appears above the ground of an article, a headline that reads, "St. Paul man dies after illness of short duration." St. Paul man dies after illness of short duration. Mr. Jerry Clark, resident of St. Paul for 25 years, died shortly after becoming ill on a streetcar on his way to work at the Union Depot, where he has been employed for some time as a red cap. He was removed from the streetcar and taken to Anchor Hospital, where he died an hour later. Mr. Clark was well known throughout the Twin Cities and had many friends. The cause of his sudden death has not been determined. Your great-grandfather worked the train line as a porter also. He would become ill on a streetcar on his way to work. It is the beginning of a sentence preceded by the subject in the headline, "St. Paul man dies after illness of short duration." And here you are also thinking about the duration of the sentence alongside that of Jerry's illness. He is sentenced, and sentencing the guilty is a means of adding a number of days or months or years in which the body is restricted. It is time both added to and subtracted from the body. So Jerry is here sentenced to the train line, is on his way and on a streetcar from which his body need be removed. That removal followed by another. He died an hour later. The cause of his sudden death has not been determined. But what is the sentence but a determination of the body's removal? Nothing subtle or sudden. It is the ongoing removal of the black body from the line, a sentence proceeding to its punctuated end. St. Paul man dies after illness of short duration. St. Paul, an abbreviation of saint, some robed, some holy, some revered, but almost always dead. Your dead are not saints. Your dead are abbreviated. Man, postscript of personhood or appeal for it, such as, "I am a man, am dying to become one." dies. After illness, what is the after in the always already of the prepositional or relationship between the part and the whole, like the illness of the man or the duration of his dying? Short, epigram collapsing a streetcar, short time abutted by a long sentence. Duration, the time during which the illness or the dying or the after, the time during which the man, the time of the illness of saint, of the short after, the time during which man dies, where illness shorts man of an after. The St. Paul man dies not of illness. The St. Paul man dies of duration. St. Paul makes you wonder about the draw to name cities after saints of men. St. Paul makes for an escape at first, but sundown is everywhere in America. You wonder how time spills from the body, collides with it, makes of the body a city's remains. Draw a clock, each hand an attempt at a kind of precision for time's owners. Draw a streetcar, a red cap, draw the body that wears it, draw the worn body's exhaustion, and as you accumulate an image through tentative lines, draw the line that ain't one. To name Jerry and Reginald and Regina, to name a collision happening over and over and over and over and over. Cities are lonely places, as in your family is several cities, and you belong to none of them. Of men. Man is not a category that interests you. Man is a kind of performance of being in the world, a hollowed out production that is overread as the human. Humanness and open mouth are row of teeth. Humanness a category with a fledgling history that continues to produce your fast and slow death. Is not our effacement something incommensurable with description? Your child once asked you how old you will have been today, the order in their time-based inquiry disrupted. You do not know the order. If Jerry is going or coming from the streetcar, his body is not there. His body is removed. A category. You are the afterthought of category. It's parenthetical. That interests you. Dies. No one makes it out of here alive. And then there are those who did not make it here living, whose deaths occur post-mortem. See it. You want to invert the word, either to signal its reversal or to make death a contronym. Those who have been refrained from life may also be its chorus. After illness, you presume a time when you are not ill. You are not. Illness of short duration in his body is his body. Where a man dies after illness of short duration, it is really the man who is of short duration. You presume a time of birth for Jerry. All you are able to find is the record of his death, the census data stuttering over years, 1891 or 1889. There's far more precision over his death, accounting for the removal of his body from a time when it was supposedly here. When you say death, what you really mean is time. You are stuck at the cause of his sudden death, not being determined. You are unsure what would be determined that would satisfy you. You are stuck, held hostage by a grammar that refuses to determine what is killing you. You are not stuck at the cause of his sudden death not being determined. You are not unsure what would be determined that would satisfy you. You are not stuck, held hostage by a grammar that refuses to determine what is killing you. Of the here, now, future, you are of the gone. You are not you are not searching for redemption or the affirmation of having referent. You see yourself as though you are on your way to work, already half a ghost. And as you linger here, it is not to recover what is already gone. You linger here to sketch the shape of undetermined death, because gone might be the only available arrival. You want remains. You feel remains. You want. You stop performing remains. Short, as in the remains of what is left from what is cut. What is left? What remains on the train, on the tracks, what haunts is just underneath the skin, remembered within the cells, what spells are in your name, what intrudes, spills from the body, from the grammar, from time, what persists, lingers, is just on the tip of your tongue, what debris, what rubble, what fragment torn and time worn, what loss echoing until it reaches you, is cut. Duration, temporary as debris and long as the conditions that make it. It is not temporary to exact names from worn papers that can't give cause. Their suddenness is only a narrow passage to names. It is temporary to learn your kin who are unable to represent a full account, leaving you with this loss, glimpsing through a dark screen where the names just fade. It is not temporary to extract, to learn names from your kin who worn papers are unable to represent, that can't give a full account, cause, leaving you with their suddenness. This loss is only a glimpsing through a narrow passage to dark screens where the names just fade. No matter how minor the debris, it is evidence of something that remains. It is not just remains, it remains. And here you are, a nodal point among the remains of the fraught sentences that led you here, led to you, their duration like the relative pitch between one body and another. Jerry, a note with too long an interval between you. You are note and interval. You are relative and remains. How to end this sentence or stretch it until it buckles beneath the weight of pronoun and participle and predicate, breaking, and there in the break is where you enter the underground, where the slant rhyme of your body is not illness or man, is not after or death, is not short or duration. It is all of these things and their syntactical limit. And that's where I'll stop. That's what I...
I wanted you to read something.
Okay.
Page 6.
Yes.
So Chaun and I go back a little ways, actually. We first contacted each other through Peter Ratcliffe, probably in 2017. I was in Iowa. And Peter told me there was something on Pullman porters.
Mm-hmm.
And so I take it this is the result of that. I was expecting a history book. But it turned out not to be a history book, but it is a fabulous book. Buy it, read it. What Chaun has read and shown you is a portion of sort of the creativity that is in the book. I think some of the images are also very effective in passing on or conveying the message that he's trying to pass on to us. But there was a particular passage on page 6, the second paragraph, that I thought was indicative of something about the flavor of Chaun's writing and how the images and the graphics and so the typography that he poetically puts into the text is captured in this one paragraph. That's my opinion. You may not agree, but...
So with Ashon Crawley, beginning with Ashon Crawley? Okay, so Ashon Crawley writes about a sermon given by Wandalin Stokes where the texture of sound created through the inhalation and exhalation of interaction of air with flesh creates an opening in the collective breathing and enunciation of the church. Her whooping produced the sonic space as discontinuous and open to other voices that preceded her moment of being overcome with spirit. Oh, my Lord, give us commas, dear Lord, sweaty as the archbacks that labored all week to bring us before the altar and give us breath whooping, oh Lord, oh my Lord, against the weapons formed against me, against the routine suppression of black breathing, our breathing and insistence outside the sentence's capacity to hold or to apprehend.
Yeah, yes. Beautiful. I thought it was a beautiful sentence, beautiful paragraph.
Thank you.
So, can you help us, this photo's on the ground, and looks like this wonderful child here, so.
I am this wonderful child.
Who or what inspired you to write this book?
It was a number of things. So I talk about at the onset of Without Terminus about an interview that I conducted with my mother. And so I conducted this interview in 2015 and was asking her questions just to kind of record some family history. And a part of what she told me was about how her father, my grandfather, worked as a porter for the Great Northern Railroad. And that after 25 years, that when he retired, that all he received, what she would say is that he received a pen with the number 25 on it, but that he did not receive pension. And so this was something that really, I think that the way she told me, and the casualness with which she told me this information was something that was very troubling to me. That it was something that I wanted to ask questions of my own about, to investigate on my own. And so I think that it began there with that particular interview, and then proceeded with a number of other things. So,
Okay. So you've won awards for both gentrification and whale song. What led you to go from poetry to this nonfiction? Yeah,
I think that, I don't know necessarily that I think of it as a leap in that way. Because I think that the work that I did with gentrification or with whale song, that a lot of those, were also engaging and stretching what I think was imagined as the discrete poem. And I think that sometimes people think of poetry in a particular, they have a particular set of ideas about what the poem is. And I think that Black Lit has always been doing this, right? I think that, whether we're talking about W.E.B. Du Bois and the Souls of Black Folk, which was in some ways engaging in memoir, but it's also engaging in ethnomusicology, that a text like that was hybrid, right? It was a early hybrid text. That Jean Toomer's Cane is, in my opinion, a hybrid text, right? That is doing all of these varied things in relationships. So if we, we could try to pin it down as a novel, but I don't know that it wants us to do that, right? And so I think that I was always interested in local histories, whether that be the history of North Minneapolis and the way that Blackness is understood as being read through North Minneapolis, like the way that it is projected onto North Minneapolis, and so looking at various like archives in relationship to that, but also like interested in, you know, histories of the Middle Passage with whale song, and then here in this relationship with this text, I'm more interested in thinking about my grandfather, but in doing that, I'm also wanting to use that as a means of asking all of these other questions, right? Like, and so, though I'm writing about like my grandfather Reginald or my great-grandfather Jerry, I'm thinking about those things as a way to consider, well, what is it that the railroad is, like as a like technology, or like what is it that the archive is as a technology, and how do we think about the way these technologies did this dispossessing work, whether they did that through the alienable labor of my grandfather, and the way that, you know, my grandfather and his father, my great-grandfather, were not enslaved, right? But the transformation of slavery ends up happening through what, you know, Saidiya Hartman would call the gift of freedom, right? And that gift of freedom, in air quotes, right, is something where we can sell our labor, but we're selling that labor to what? Like, you know, to whether that be sharecropping or being indebted laborers or landless tenants in some respect. So, and the alternative being that if I do not exercise that liberty, that my lack of exercising that liberty puts me on the chain gang or some other kind of punitive measure that is taken by the state. So I was interested in like what choices were available, what coercions were happening, and in what ways can I think about those things while thinking about like my grandfather, which is a long way to answer a question that was much shorter.
No. It's all good. You know, my great-grandfather was a Pullman porter as well, and, you know, but he lived to be 90. Mm-hmm. He did retire. Mm-hmm. But you could tell the wear and tear it took on his body, you know, and so he wound up having his foot amputated, actually, towards the end of his life. But, you know, the Pullman porter was oftentimes viewed as a slave. Mm-hmm. You know, it was the transformation of chattel slavery into railroad slavery, if you will, right? And there were many kinds of porters. So, you know, you talk about your great-grandfather being a Pullman porter, but the grandfather dying as a red cap, right? And porters were another kind of red cap.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, and as a red cap that died at 46, right? Like, and so, and looking at, I'm going to slip on the name of the person that was mentioned, but there's this wonderful book called Black Folk that does this work, this historical work on the black working class in the United States.
Blair Kelly.
Yeah, but she writes about and has this chapter that's on what's called the Jeremiad of the porter, and she thinks about, she has this brief like passage, not at length, but she talks about this porter that wrote this pamphlet, right? And then this pamphlet that he writes, he relates, then describes the relationship of that labor as a kind of enslavement, right? Like, and so, and in talking about it, talks about how there were a number of porters who would be working at so many strained hours that they would, in some instances, just drop dead, right? Like, and so, thinking about Jerry and that particular image that was drawn in the obituary, brought some connections to like what this porter was describing in terms of the wear and tear of that labor on the body, right? Yeah. That, you know, as you were providing leisure for others, because the sleeping car was a space of leisure, right? Like it was a space in which some people experienced leisure, right? But the porter was not one of them, right? Like the porter did not have access to this leisure that they were providing, right? That was experienced by necessity of the porter not getting that leisure. And so those things, that paradox was really interesting to me.
It is. I mean, for those of you who don't know sort of The Pullman company was not a railroad company. It was a manufacturing company. It manufactured these sleeping cars, and it leased the sleeping cars to the railway companies. But if you purchased a Pullman ticket, you went wherever the car went. So the porter who attended the car traveled with the car, not with the railroad. So the car could start on the Northern Pacific in St. Paul, let's say, go to Chicago, come back to St. Paul, go out to Seattle or Portland. The car could then shift to a Central Pacific Railroad train, and go from Portland or Seattle to Oakland, Los Angeles, and the porter is still with the car, go from Los Angeles to New Orleans, and then come back up from New Orleans to Chicago to come back to St. Paul. And the porter stayed with the car. So they would have maybe 400 hours sometimes or more of work. And a porter could get reprimanded or penalized for sleeping on the job, because the porter was expected to attend to the passenger whenever the passenger wanted. So, yes, so porters sometimes would collapse just from sheer exhaustion and die. I wonder, though, you talk about the terminus, and that's the interesting thing about porters and sleeping cars. There wasn't like a terminus. So talk about how you put the terminus into your work, in this work.
No, that's a great question. I think that I work against it, to be honest. Like, I think that that I'm attempting to write something that doesn't have an arrival, right? That doesn't have a discrete end to it. And I think that that's a part of, I don't know, I think that we are still dealing with the open question of abolition, right? Like that, that is a still open question. So in regard to the terminus, I think that in respect to whether that be my grandfather or whether that be the conditions that anti-blackness and late-stage capitalism create for us, I think that is something that we still have to contend with, right? That is something that doesn't have it isn't over. There isn't an end to that. And in that way, I'm also attempting to take various sentences, whether that be the headline of the obituary for my great-grandfather, and think about how to extend those sentences to a breaking point. So how do you try to exhaust something that is itself attempting to exhaust you, right? How do you hold something and extend it, and in extending it or looping it, find new information about it? And I think that this is also something that the Black church teaches me, right? Like that in growing up through that, though I don't have like a doxological relationship with the church, I myself am agnostic, that I was interested in the ways that growing up and the experiences aesthetically and otherwise that happened for me in the church were ones that taught me something about how we could return to something in terms of a piece of information through a chorus or through a sermon, and that in returning to it over and over again, that we could never exhaust its limit or its potential for meaning making. That there was something about the way that a chorus, as simple and as short as it might be, could be extended and always be made new, right? That it was never exhausted of its potential for a creative output and launch point for something else, right? And I think that that's like methodologically something that, I take very seriously in my own work, right?
Yes.
Is how to return to something, and how to return and utilize repetition in a way that is not about a certain kind of redundancy, but how to think about information through that repetition, whether that be me just saying certain dry material like the birth year of my grandfather being 1913, him being black and him being a porter. But if I return to that information again and again, what new things might I be able to say or think new about it as I continue to engage with it?
What I saw in that was sort of, again, the way in which, in fact, railroads do this repetition. You know, they have these routes, you know, that the hauntingness of the haint that is sort of pushing your story in this is also part of that repetition, you know, and that begins to make the meaning of your work even more significant, because it asks us to think about memory and how memory needs to be repeated in order to be remembered, right? Yeah, and it's you know, it's one of those things that too, like I think with the railroad, both with repetition but also time, that like, you know, so many of our notions of time being built from the railroad, right? Like whether we think about centralized time and its connection to the railroad, or that we think about the way that transformation was, or transportation rather, was so significantly transformed through the railroad, that my understanding spatially, like that our spatial understanding becomes different in terms of like how I think about my relationship to another place and my ability to go there, which could have been, you know, 3 weeks of travel to a place prior, that ends up becoming so greatly reduced in the way that that we think about this. So just like that relationship to time, but then what does that necessitate? That reduction in time with that transportation, always there's this way that there becomes a kind of romantic relationship to the railroad then, where it's like this technology that does this incredible work of transforming the country and it's many different, whether we're talking about like it's the way things are shipped to the way people travel, but we don't. There's not as much emphasis on the great deal of violence that it required to make that happen, right? Yeah. Like whether we're thinking about the theft of land or the way that bodies are made to labor until death in order to transform and make this technology possible, right? I mean, that was I thought, you know, the way in which you brought John Henry, or the legend of John Henry, into this story, right? It was like, whoa. John Henry, you know, the legendary John Henry was a railroad worker who battled the steam engine in building I think it was Norfolk and Louisville Railroad. Anyways, you know, John Henry worked himself to death in defeating the railroad. And it made me think of, have you read James Allen McPherson's A Solo Song for Doc?
I have not, no.
You should.
Yeah.
You should. That is also very much a John Henry-esque story. And the other thing it made me think about was the expression John Henrying. You know, anybody have any idea what John Henrying is? John Henrying is what you're doing with language. You know, you John Henry the language. You make it work, and you work it and work it and work it, and because you're trying to work it out. You're trying to develop this language that is not a language yet to be.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, John Henry too, like, I mean, that story is told in some ways triumphantly, right? Like that John Henry defeats or beats the technology. But in every single telling, he dies, right? Like every telling. So to understand that story is, I relate. It's a blues story, right? Like it's not a triumphant like story, and in some ways too, that mirrored at least some engagements that I saw with the story of porters, right? Like that the story of porters could be and has been told as a triumphant story, right? That it's a story where black folks who were porters who had, some, treatment that was done to them that was terrible and bad, yet they were able to have a job that, led to a middle class life, right? Can be a part of the story, right? Like, or at least and I'm saying this in a crude fashion, right? But that the frame of that story is one that has been told, right? Like it's not always told, but it has been told as one that is about how black folks have gotten to uplift, right? Like it's an uplift narrative where there is struggle and there is difficulty, but ultimately they triumph, right? But in the instance of my grandfather, it's far closer to the blues story of John Henry, where he always dies, right? Like, and there's not a changing of the dying in relationship to the labor that may or may not have produced this so-called better life, right? That's not and I think that's in some ways the way we impose that uplift narrative on the porters ends up having us lose certain forms of historical data, right? That we don't get to see and understand what that labor meant, what it cost, and who it cost, right? So I think that's also been that was a major concern for me in the writing.
I used to read the John Henry legend to my daughter when she was a child, and her question at the end was, "Why does he always have to die, Daddy?"
Right.
One of the things I thought that the book does too, it does take us out of the story of porters and the union and the success story, but it gives this other side of the porter's story. Was that your intention, or was there something else that you were doing?
I think that there is a way that there are times in which, and ways in which the union story can overshadow stories like that of my grandfather. Because as much as he was a part of a local union, right? And I say this to say, one, that as someone who supports unions, has been a part of unions, has fought for unions, they did not save my grandfather in this regard, right? And it's not, and it did not provide the various things that one might think they would needed to have provided for a worker like my grandfather. And so in some ways, I'm interested in moving away from that, because I think there's ways that still rings as that kind of triumphant narrative, right? It still rings as well, we beat the technology of the
Pullman company.
Of the Pullman company. But I'm still looking for who died, right? I'm still looking for who died at the end of that, right? And who was exhausted at the end of that race, right? Even in terms of and I mean, if you read the story of John Henry in the many ways that it's told and the many ways that it's sung, because there are thousands of versions of it, there are ways that it becomes exhausting to read it, right? It becomes exhausting to think about, well, he does get the water at the end in some instances, it's there's a bit of perhaps relief, right? But he dies, right? And I think that to me, that resounding repetition of the dying is something that I'm always trying to think about, well, is this a way that we can, one, is this a way that is that a way of understanding Blackness in the U.S. and diaspora? And if so, what are the implications of that, right? Like, and what other questions do I have that attend to that? And I think that those are part of also like what I'm attempting to like wrestle with in the book.
So that's, it kind of leads me to this whole notion of how did the character of your grandfather and great-grandfather sort of develop as you wrote the book? For you, yeah.
In a lot of ways, I think, you know, and I get at this in parts of the book, right? Like that, you know, my mother kind of serves as an inaugural archive for me, right? Like, and so I access my grandfather through my mother, right? But me and my mother have a fractured like relationship, which I also discuss in the space of the book, right? And I think that a part of what was difficult to consider and think about in writing it was, one, if I'm making a structural critique of the railroad, right? Like, how do you hold on to that structural critique of the railroad and still deal with the interpersonal violence, right? And specifically that, like, a part of the way that I consider and think about my grandfather and what I know of him is that, you know, he was dealing with all of this violence that was being done on his body, and I do think it's important to call it this, right? Like that these that the extension of this labor, that the lack of sleep, that the punitive measures that are taken by a company to say that you cannot sleep is a kind of violence. It's a kind of violence against the body, right? And so in his inability to deal with that violence, it often turns home. You know, like that it often turns on interpersonal relationships. And so that was also, you know, he was a violent person. And so thinking about, you know, my mother and her sisters and the kind of collateral damage of that, like, and thinking of my own mother's like relationship to me in the process of considering that. And so I think that a part of that was like, can I disentangle, do you end up forfeiting a structural critique, right? While engaging in that interpersonal examination of his own violence, right? And I think it was necessary, right? Like I ultimately do it. It was a late hour edit, right? It was late hour writing. Mm-hmm. So I think that was a part of perhaps like some form of discovery for me, was thinking about and considering and seeing the necessity of taking into consideration like my grandfather's violence, right? Like thinking about the way that violence always echoes, right? Like that it has these forms of echoes. And so that, I think the discovery for me was also like learning about his check, right, that he received, right? It's the only record of a check that I have for him, but he received a check, right? And that check was dated a month after he died. And to deal with that record, right? Like, and to think about and take into consideration, one, that when I contacted the Atlanta archives, right, and asked them about the check specifically, because when you go to when you contact these archives, oftentimes we're only getting these photocopies of the record, right? Yeah. And you're paying for those photocopies, right? Which feels often too very, to me, right? Like it's very frustrating, right? Like, but like to ask them and to engage with them about how I wanted the check, like not the photocopy of the check. I want the physical document, right? Like I feel entitled to the physical document, right? But to have them tell me that, one, that they don't own it, that the Railroad Retirement Board owns it, and that they only steward it for the Railroad Retirement Board, also was very interesting to me, right? Because I think that sometimes we deal with the archive and we think about it as something where, like, for those of us who have this ruptured history, right, whether that be through enslavement or colonialism, that there is a rupture in the space of like the historical archive. And I think that sometimes what happens in dealing with that rupture is the approach can be, well, we want to include these missing narratives that are absent from the archive in the archive and expand it by way of that, right? Yep. Like that we can do this work of expanding what is missing from the archive by including these missing narratives. But in this instance, what I don't have access to because it was archived, right? And so there is a way that the archive also does this dispossessing work. And I don't know that that's often discussed or thought about, right? That the archive is itself a dispossessing technology, or at least it can be, right? And so, and I say that not to say, well, we should never archive something, or nothing should be preserved in this particular kind of way. But I do think that we have to reckon with what is the cost of that preservation when it is removed from those with whom there is a kind of vibration to the material, right? Like that I have a personal vibration connection to the material and am disconnected from it by way of it being archived. So I think that those were points of discovery for me in the space of the writing.
Yeah, I mean, recently I think Harvard had to return photographs of a enslaved man and woman who was his wife to the descendants of that man, because they said, these are our relatives. These are not Harvard's.
Right. And I mean, and more recently than that, like, with regard to the MOVE bombing in 1985, that there were the bones of children that were in the fire of the building that was bombed by like the Philadelphia police in connection to the mayor and the FBI, that bombing and the children that ended up dying were put into like an anthropological study. Like, and so without the parents' knowledge, right? That the parents didn't even know that their children's bones were being used in this way. Until very recently, I think it was like 2021, where that was brought to light and where there was, an engagement of a conversation around, well, how do we go about using these things ethically, right? Like, and so just the lack of consideration, the way that even, the very bodies of people become made to be used after their death in this particular kind of like study, it just makes me consider like these are those echoes of, and these are the afterlives of slavery, right? Like these are slavery's afterlives, and the way that we don't even possess ourselves even in death, like and after death.
What other besides Atlanta? What other archives did you?
It was the Atlanta archives. It was my mother's, personal like material, and then it was those oral stories. Right?
Okay.
And so,
okay. But did you contact the Railroad Retirement Board?
The Railroad Retirement Board, no. In terms of like a request for the check,
yeah.
No. I think that a part of me was interested in the meaning of that language of ownership, but not necessarily in an attempt to continue to pursue the material.
No. Mm-hmm. I mean, there's such an emotional core in this book, personal, obviously, but how did that change over from the beginning of your vision of this book till its final product?
I mean, it changes in ways that, I think in some ways it changes, in other ways it stays the same.
Okay.
Right? Like I think there is a desire for like, I think that like initially I probably wanted more historical book, like one that was going to be a clean historical narrative around whether that be unions or like porters as laborers, and trying to like put together something that was more discreet. But it's not my training, and I ended up being more interested in following particular things that were about loss, about the way that blackness and attempting to describe loss through blackness becomes itself a kind of like theoretical problem. Like how do you, like, you know, as Frank B. Wilderson III talks about, how do you narrate the loss of loss, right? So I think that is, you know, a kind of consistent thing that's remained for me in the writing of the book. But it evolved, right? Like it did evolve. I think the emotional connection like remains very much the same. Like I'm still angry as ever in relationship to, I think, what it costs. But I also think that, you know, this wasn't just about how upset I was about those things. I also think that I was wanting to explore the loneliness of a kind of rift and rupture that I experienced personally in not having access to certain family histories. And I think that in exploring that, I was trying to ask some questions about blackness in the diaspora. And so I think that those are things that, like, you know, both stayed the same, but then also things that shifted, like in the writing.
Yeah, I mean, I noticed that. I mean, there's a very creative aspect to the book. There's also an aesthetic aspect. You're also a graphic designer, and I think that shows up in obviously the product.
Yeah.
Talk about what you were trying to do aesthetically with this text.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at some of the pages of the text, like there'll be text that is running off the margins, that is superimposed, and I think that I think about those things in relationship to my own upbringing in the Pentecostal church. And so, you know, Harriet Mullen talks about African science and spirit writing, right? Like she has this essay that was from 1993 that thinks about this notion of like what she calls spirit writing. We could talk about Lucille Clifton, who did the same, right? Like, and so Lucille Clifton thinking about this certain kind of access that she had to knowledge that was outside the space of the rational, right? Like that wasn't about a particular kind of like rational reasoning, but that was maybe like supra rational, right? Like, and so I think about, you know, that superimposition of text like as a way of speaking in tongues, as a kind of glossolalia, right? Where there is a languaging that's happening that's outside the space of what we might discreetly call knowledge or what is knowable, right? And so how do we access those things that are outside of our ready availability for knowledge, whether that be they are just missing from an archival record, or there is just these brief flashes of memory that we get, like I got from my mother in interviewing her, that those are things that exist like in a kind of limited space. And so I explore those in these other ways in my design in the text. And so it's the photographic image that ends up in the text. Yes. And there are ways that becomes, it fades as the text goes on, right? Like in terms of like one of the only images that I have of my grandfather sleeping, that is a part of a kind of a dream sequence that ends up fading throughout the course of the book. So I think that like, you know, images and text as image were definitely really important.
I was suggesting that we needed to have more photos in the display here. I think the other aspect that I thought was fascinating about this work is the wondrousness that here we are dealing with a death in 1935 that you had no experience with personally, and yet throughout this narrative, you're wondering, continually wondering, and being haunted, your term, by it. How does that then become sort of motivating the completion of the text?
Yeah, Douglas Kearney had a conversation with Evie Shockley, two of my favorite poets. And in the conversation, I remember him talking with her, talking about how he wanted to haunt his own memories. And I've like sat with that for quite a while, like, right? Like, and how do we go about doing that? How do you haunt your own memories? And so I think in ways, like, I think that that's a part of what I'm attempting to do in the text is to haunt my memories, but also my memories of my mother's memories, right? And so I think that those are that haunting and the ghostly, they're the cost of, like, and I'm not going to forget, like, the scholar that writes about this, but it's the cost of subjection. Haunting is the cost of subjection. To the extent that we inflict subjection on the land and the body, haunting is the cost, right? It'll echo, right? And I think that I'm searching for the echo, and I'm looking for ways to make it material and sonic in the space of the writing.
You use this term hauntology. Would you break that down for us a little bit?
Well, and I think, yeah. So I'll talk a little bit about hauntology, and then maybe we can open it up to folks that, to the extent that y'all have questions here. But like, I think hauntology gets far too often connected to the Derridas and the Avery Gordons, and I think that there's a way that, like, and as important as that work has been to me, right? Like, but like, I think as we think about a study of the spectral, of the specter, of the ghostly, right? Like, whether we, the way that the ghostly gets thought of post World War I, because all of this death happens, right? I think there's a way that Black folks have always been dealing with haunting, right? And I talk about how the Black historical is already the hauntological, right? That to read Black history is to step into the haunting. I don't have to do anything fantastic. I don't have to I don't have to create vampires, or like I'm not like I don't have to do any of this other work. Like, it is just there in the space of the history. The haunting is there. And so I think, for me, like, when I think about hauntology, or when I think about what becomes the kind of curriculum for how I think about hauntology, I start with, like, whether that be Beloved or Sadia Hartman's Scenes of Subjection, that Kindred. There is the Kindred, like, becomes a space in which, like, there is this other material understanding of hauntology and a curriculum for it that is just Black history, right? And that's, and I mean, there's so much more that could be discussed in it, for sure.
I talk about that as sort of the unknown known. Right. I do want to thank you for bringing Henry Dumas back into our consciousness. Henry Dumas was
so important.
Died too young. Was one of my favorite poets back in the day.
Died aboard a train. Was, there's contending stories about what preceded him being shot. Henry Dumas, like, Toni Morrison posthumously publishes much of his work. Much of his work wasn't published until after he died.
Yep.
He fantastic writer. Everybody should read him. I think he should be on so many more syllabus. But his death was overshadowed by how close in time it was after the assassination of Dr. King, right? And so many people weren't as aware of his death until much later, and so it just kind of gets covered over. But it's an important story. He's an important writer.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Before we go and turn it over to the audience, anything you're working on that you want to share with us? What's coming up?
Right now I'm just doing lots of reading, and so I think that right now is more about gathering, and I'm thinking about madness actually a lot, and so and thinking about madness and language, and so doing a lot of reading about. There's a really good book that I'm reading right now that's talking about the relationship between the Black ecstatic in religion and madness, because oftentimes religious ecstaticism was actually a reason why Black folks were put inside those kinds of asylums at the early part of the 20th century. And so I'm really interested in a number, but I'm always kind of I'm just reading widely right now. Okay. Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. No, thank you. What are y'all thinking? What's the word? Yeah.
So I have 2 questions for you. Thank you. So you mentioned that your great-grandfather, I believe, was working as a porter in the early 1900s. So at the same time, I know that industrialization was extremely strong, and figures like John D. Rockefeller were creating this sense of the American dream. So how would you say that your grandfather's specific experiences would have kind of shown a new light of how the American dream affected other people, or how his version of what the American dream was, working on the railway?
Yeah, I don't think it was a dream for many, whether that be my great-grandfather or grandfather. Any kind of communication that my mom had in terms of her father about the job, he talked about how he hated it, right? He hated the job. He hated the way he was treated and who he had to serve. And I think that's not discussed enough. That we're given narratives about labor that folks are supposed to just endure it, right? You are just supposed to continue to do the work and continue to try to make do with what you have, but you're not supposed to be upset about the conditions, and you're not supposed to hate the people you work for, though my mom talks about how he did, right? So those emotions are seeing the guy talks about ugly feelings, right? And I was really interested in the ugly feelings, right? What's the bitterness of this? What is the regret, right? What is the, everybody kind of talks about the notion of no regrets, and I feel I have all the regrets, right? I'm I would do every single thing different, right? I think there's ways that exploring those sets of feelings becomes really important. And so no, I don't think he felt, I don't imagine that he did think it was a dream, right? I think, again, it's that quote, gift of freedom, that you have the liberty to exercise this gift through selling your labor. But the alternative is like what? Like you starve? Like it's the, like at certain periods of time, it's the chain gang, right? So what is the alternative? That's a kind of coercion, right? Like I think we're not in a framework where we consent to how we sell our labor, and that is the afterlife of slavery, right? So I think that's it's not the same thing that my great-grandfather's parents endured who were formerly enslaved, right? But it is its afterlife, right? It is connected to those same modes of relation. So I think, no, like I'm not, it wasn't a dream. Like I'm not too excited about the 250th. Like, you know, I think that like those narratives are ones that, like, you know, they only do so much for, like, they don't do much for me. Like, and I don't imagine that he felt a certain set of relationships to them. Though, I mean, that's an open question too, right? Because we struggle with that also. Like, I think that it's a seductive kind of narrative too, right? So I want to leave space for that, like, you know. But yeah, maybe that's how I would answer that. Yeah.
My next question was, how do you think these feelings and emotions, and how do you think, and what ramifications do you think they had on Black culture in, like, going forward?
I'm not sure. Like, I don't know that I can make broad statements on like what it would have meant for like Black culture. But like, I think there are a number of ways in which those kinds of like ugly feelings are always present, right? Whether that be like, you know, we were like, when I was in my MFA program, like we were made to read all these books, right, that like, you know, and have all these conversations about them in the space of the program. And sometimes that was good, and a lot of times it wasn't. And one of the books that we were made to read, like, was about this woman, Mrs. Bridge, right? I hate this book so much. It was like it had this story about this white woman who, like, you know, was bemoaning her life and the various things that weren't happening for her. But she had these Black servants, right, in the book, right? And they were very ancillary to the story, and they didn't have last names. And these Black servants that were in the story, they were treated terribly by Mrs. Bridge all the time, right? Like, all the time. And in the instances in which there was this one part of the book, where one of the Black servants is getting a phone call with a job offer at a job that's paying better, right? And it's like all around it looks like it's like this is the better option, and they tell the person offering them the job that they can't do it, that they just got to continue to work for Mrs. Bridge because they have this relationship with her. They're like family, right? I was livid. Like, I literally almost threw the book. But I think that we end up, there's a part of the white imagination that doesn't want to understand Black rage, and maybe the conditions that underlie that rage, right? So I think, you know, in the instance of my grandfather, in the instance of so many others throughout history, those ugly feelings are always like present. Like, I don't know necessarily what their ramifications are on a cultural level, but they're present, and they contend with the way that we might neatly want to think about, you know, historical progress. Clarence. Sorry. What's up?
Thanks. I'm thinking about a lot of things, of course, but sort of building off of James mentioning the idea of John Hennering the text to death, and the notion of hybridity, and you're using that very strongly in this. So the first encounter I had with this was in an oral presentation, so in a very different mode than what we'll get if we purchase the physical copy of the book. So it's a pleasure to see more of that displayed in the book and in the presentation. But unfortunately, I don't have their names in front of me, but I was at a conference where it was mostly, well, all of the panelists were Asian or Asian American, but they were talking about hybridity and the necessity of it for people of color and black people, and that I think one of them said that the modes that we generally have available to us, or how they're categorized, or the genres, do not have the capacity to hold the grief of black and brown people. And I'm wondering about this. I mean, I know you primarily as a poet, but when you conceived of this, were you thinking poetry? Were you thinking initially a prose memoir kind of thing, or was it always this hybrid thing? And how do you see that as necessary? And could this be done any other way?
No, that's a great question. I don't know that I write anything that's not hybrid, to be quite honest. Like I don't like, as much as like gentrification might be sold as a book of poetry, right? Like our whale song might be sold as a book of poetry, right? Like I don't know that I'm ever not like doing something that isn't in some way like hybrid. And I think that's just a part of my own interest in reading, right? Like in terms of like who I'm reading, right? But it's also like, what do I think language has the capacity to hold in some respects? Like, where does language fail us? I taught a class that's called Tentative Lines, the Poetics of Failure. And that was a class where we talked a lot about the limits of language, right? Like where does language find its limit, right? Like, so for instance, there's this book by Banu Capio called Schizophrene, right? And in Schizophrene, Banu Capio is attempting to deal with partition, right? This parting gift from England to India that fractures land and people, and it's deadly in massive ways in terms of its consequences. And she's attempting to write this like kind of discrete historical narrative around it. And she writes it in a notebook, and then she fails. Like at the end of it, she's like, it's impossible to write a discrete narrative about partition, and she throws it into the snow, right? And then retrieves it from the snow and in the spring, and the fractured fragments from it, that residue, is what becomes the basis for Schizophrene, right? And thinking about texts like that, and thinking about how there's a way that that language, there's a kind of way that she works with decay in the space of that book. Thinking about M. Norbese Philip, in the way that they write song, right, which is a book about this case where enslaved Africans were brought aboard the ship Zong from West Africa to Jamaica, and it was supposed to be a 2-week trip that ended up being like 3 months, and they didn't have the provisions necessary, and so they threw many overboard. Some jumped overboard. The numbers are all muddy. We don't know necessarily how many people, right? But we know about this through the court case, the Gregson v. Gilbert court case, where the owners of the ship sue the insurance company so that they can rectify the loss of their goods, right? So that is the case. And then M. Norbese Philip says, okay, I'm going to take the court case and the language of the court case and I'm gonna fracture it. I'm gonna do damage to it. I'm gonna perform an erasure on it, right? Because language itself can't tell me what actually happened in the space of the slave ship Zong and the lives of those who were captured who are not named in that court case and who are not named on the ledger of the ship, right? Like that, these are the missing, fractured, ruptured aspects of it. And so she engages in something that is speculative, that is essayistic in the sense of like what she writes afterwards in the Natunda section of Zong. It is a song in the sense of the slave ship Zong is Z-O-N-G, but the text Zong is Zong exclamation point. It is Zong, right? It is an exclamation of breath, right? That she's giving to the text, right? Like, and so she teaches me what language fails in its ability to do to describe the horrors of the ship. Renee Gladman. Renee Gladman, she has this wonderful text that's called Prose Architectures, where in Prose Architectures, which is actually where in the afterword of Prose Architectures is where I take Fred Moulton's quote, is there an underground railroad for the sentence? But she writes about how like she began to see the inability of like written language doing the thing that she wanted it to do. So she starts to draw these structures, right? Like these cities of sorts, right? Like, and it's like these wonderful drawings that look in some ways like language in some spaces of the drawing, but she calls these drawings language. And then she calls her languaging, her written languaging drawing. And there's this way that she talks about how to formally draw was something that gave her an ability to access thought at a parallel with thought, because writing is always happening after thought, right? It's happening after we're doing the thinking. And so drawing was this way that she could access something more directly connected to thought. And in that way, like, I feel like that's a kind of hybridity in relationship to what Gladman was doing. So in all these ways, this is like, if I were to build a syllabi, that's all on it, right? Like, you know, and there's 100 other texts that are on it. But I think I'm always writing hybrid, and I think that I'm like, you know, I'm like interested in, you know, I think if I were to articulate what Black studies is in some ways, you know, I would echo folks like Hartman who talk about it as the end of disciplinarity, right? Like, at least that a part of its goals is the end of disciplinarity, which in some ways is an end to genre or an end to a particular kind of discrete understanding of it, right? Like, and so I'm always trying to get outside the borders of what I think maybe either poetry or the essay are saying they should do, right? Like, what is it that it should sound and look like? And my favorite writers are always doing that, like, you know? And we are like at like 2 or 3:40, so I want to make sure that we have space and time for, you know, Subtext is here, and they're selling books in the back. I'm going to stick around here for a little bit. There are a few more letterpress prints from a part of Without Terminus that is sitting on like the back table back there, and so like those are free. You can take one as they are left. And thank you everyone for coming out. Thank you to. Did you have a question? Did you have a question? Mickey has a question. I'm like.
I'm just ready in case anyone else had another question before we wrap. I'm just ready to deliver the microphone. Yeah.
Does anyone else have a question?
All right. You can go ahead and close out.
Thank you for opening up this space. Thank you for the work that you did here. Everybody that is a part of Eastside Freedom Library for making this possible. Dr. James Robinson for your wonderful questions. Thank you for engaging with the book. And so, no, thanks everyone for coming. Yeah.